Well, hello, BookTube. Now it is one might even say late December, and here I am about to do a November wrap-up, my delights, discoveries, disappointments wrap-up for November. What on earth is going on, you might ask yourself? Well, blame COVID. Okay, I had COVID at the beginning of November and I've been unfortunate to get kind of post-COVID fatigue issues, which basically have meant that I only had enough energy to do the basics of life and work, and sometimes not even that. But I've managed to do a delights and discoveries and disappointments wrap up every month since February 2020. So I'm jolly well not going to miss November 2021, even if this is a bit late. Now, because I couldn't do very much, I actually read quite a lot in November. I read 22 books, so I won't try and talk about all of them in this video. I'll try and keep it a bit crisper than that, but there's still quite a few. And I'll really try and focus on the kind of the tops and flops, as Britta would say. Now, but the month did involve five-star reads out of those 22, so that's not too bad a score, is it? And I've got a couple of disappointments to warn you off, I think. Now, I took part in two lovely BookTube events in November. One is IndigAthon and the other was Nonfiction November. And the IndigAthon things I read for IndigAthon, just after I'd had the worst of COVID, but before I got into the post-COVID fatigue, I managed to get out an IndigAthon wrap-up video. So I'm not going to talk about those, other than to say that two of them were two of my five-star reads. Newby. Oh, brilliant novel. This one's going to feature, I'm sure, in my best books of the year. The other 5-star was Whereas, a book of poetry, a collection of poetry by Layli Long Soldier, which was, a strong recommendation. But what about Nonfiction November? Well, I read 11 non-fiction books this November, which was more than twice as many as I intended to, put it that way. And that was actually a very rich experience. Two of those were amongst my five-star reads, and one of those two 5 stars for me was this one, The Artful Dickens by John Mullan. Now, this is a book for Dickens aficionados. Read this book if you have read and enjoyed a load of Dickens, and it will add another level to your enjoyment and appreciation of those books and make you want to read all the ones that you haven't. But if you're not a Dickens person, ignore me. It's not a book for you. The second 5-star non-fiction book I read was The Years by Annie Ernaux, translated from the French brilliantly by Alison. And people have been enthusing about that book for a while now, and I've sort of half heard that and never kind of got to grips with actually getting hold of it and reading it, and I'm so glad I did. Now, you could describe it as a memoir, but it's not a typical memoir. It's I'm going to imagine a sort of a Venn diagram of overlapping circles, and the biggest of those circles is memoir, but it's also sort of history, and it's also sort of fiction-y a bit, and it's almost sociology or social anthropology, I suppose. She starts with her life, I suppose. That's the sort of starting in the Second World War and going through to sort of just before the book came out. And she uses that, though, as a vehicle to tell almost a memoir for her generation of French women or French people generally. She uses it's written, a lot of it, in the first person plural. She's talking about we all the time. She uses images, she uses photos of her at different stages of her life, but she's describing them, she doesn't say I did this, I did that. She uses those to sort of set off different time periods. She also uses adverts and radio programs, the television people were watching, news headlines, all sorts of snippets. And that mosaic is put together, and it gives you just this picture of the life of France through that period. It's very honest. It's honest about herself. And it's also very honest about French society. I mean, for example, that very particular version of racism that the French have, although they think they don't. It was kind of an informal buddy read with Fraser Simons, who's a relatively new booktuber, and if you don't yet subscribe to Fraser, you should. He also, I think, really got a lot out of this book and would also strongly recommend it. So that's a double 5-star recommendation for that one. Now, the biggest disappointment of my month was also a non-fiction November read, and that was a book that I've been really looking forward to for some years. It's The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohllenben, translated from the German by Jane Billingshurst. And this was a huge book. Well, a huge book insofar as any book about natural history is going to be huge, but you know what I mean. So when it came out in 2015-16, it was all over the place. And I can see why, because the ideas in it are fascinating. He packs loads of really interesting ideas about trees and draws on kind of the scientific research and his own experiences to do that. But, it drove me bananas, BookTube. It really did, because his approach is to anthropomorphize trees. He talks about their thoughts and feelings as if they're human, and I know what he's trying to do. He's trying to get us to understand in human terms so that we understand trees better. But by the third time that I read, ouch, a tree supposedly saying that, I would have thrown the book across the room if it weren't for the fact that I was reading it on my Kindle. So not a recommendation from me, unless you are not irritated by that sort of style. I recovered from that by reading another natural history non-fiction book, Meadowland by John Lewis-Stemple, and the subtitle for that is The Private Life of an English Field, and that's what it is. Basically, it's a very simple, gentle, lovely book that goes month by month looking at his observations in one meadow on his farm, the flora, the fauna, the weather, what he's doing in terms of farming it. Lovely. Thinking about disappointments, or actually dissatisfaction would be a better word here, I think, in non-fiction. It brings me to mention two things. One is a book which I would actually recommend, but I was also dissatisfied by it, and I'll tell you why. And this book is White Tears, Brown Scars: How White Feminism Betrays Women of Colour by Ruby Hamad, which came out in 2020. Now, this is a book with really important ideas in it, and ones that I really want to understand as a white feminist who wants to be non-racist, anti-racist. And it delivers. But, okay, I've noticed lately a kind of a strand of non-fiction books that it feels like they should have been a really powerful, intelligent, well-formed, long essay on the subject. And instead, the author's been asked to kind of stretch them out so that they could be published as a book. And I don't think I blame the author for that. I think it's about the nature of publishing, and that, there isn't really a market for, really good long essays. But it just ends up feeling like a little bit repetitious, which is a shame when it's a really important, useful, and an otherwise well-written subject. What I liked about this one, and means I would particularly recommend it, notwithstanding the essay book stretch thing, is that Hamad is an Australian journalist, but she was born in the Lebanon, and her family are from that part of the world variously, and so she brings a really global perspective to the topic, whereas perhaps other similar things I've read have had quite a North American bias, and I valued getting that wider sort of global perspective. So I'm not recommending it, but have you come across books like that sort of they've been stretched out of shape, if you know what I mean? Anyway, that was that one. The other sort of little gripe or grumble, I suppose, or issue, problem that I'm going to describe in relation to non-fiction for me at the moment is that, I'm having a bit of trouble with travel writing and how I respond to it. And I think it may be, it's something about the tone of a lot of travel books that I used to feel quite comfortable with, and I now find a bit jarring. So I read A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush by Eric Newby, which is a classic of the travel writing genre. He wrote it in, when did it come out? It was sometime in the 1950s. And it's about, he's like a posh Englishman who goes on a sort of splendid adventure exploring in Afghanistan and having a wonderful time, and he's bold and tells you all about his with self-deprecating humor, and it's all very witty, but it's just, what gets me about those kind of books now is that it's just so disrespectful of the people that he meets. He really, he doesn't think it maybe, but it's very much the sort of funny Johnny foreigner, and heavens above, he was so unprepared for this adventure that basically these people were keeping him alive. But I don't like the way he writes about them. Now, do you find that? Does that bother you now with some travel writing? Now, you'd think that the book I read to kind of try and recover from that or counterbalance that wouldn't have had the same problem, because this one was Around the World in 80 Trains by Monisha Rajesh, and so she's a contemporary Asian British writer, and I suppose I expected something different from her, and I really felt it was a bit the same thing. It's not the same, it's not the posh Englishman, but it's still the sort of, I don't know, a sort of shallowness in an approach to the people that she met and the things that she saw for a lot of the book. And the most annoying thing about that book, is there were no maps. So if you know that a book is called Around the World in 80 Trains, would you not expect a few maps? Anyway, it's not a bad book, but just not as good as I hoped, I suppose. Now, travel writing doesn't have to be like that, does it? I was thinking about the kind that I really love, and I think the perfect travel writer for me is Patrick Leigh Fermor. And now, if you've read any of his writing, you will know that what Paddy does is he just embraces everywhere he goes and wants to totally get alongside and find out how these people tick, and if possible learn their language in order to do that. And it doesn't matter if they're Hungarian aristocrats or Bulgarian shepherds or Greek Orthodox monks, that's what he did. He's dead now, obviously, but there's a kind of travel writing that I would recommend. So moving on. The other 4 non-fiction books that I read, I'm going to leave to one side because you can't talk about everything when you read 22, unless you're Fraser Simon, who seems to pack it anyway. I'll leave that to one side. What about the fiction I read? Well, it was a solid month for fiction. I've mentioned the poetry, whereas already. The play I read was a sort of preempting the Christie's Missing readathon, and so I've done a discussing drama video about that with Tilly already. It was an Agatha Christie play, so won't talk about that. What about short stories? Yes, I read a collection of short stories this month. And, well, now you will know, if you watch my channel regularly, that short stories are always a little bit, you know, touch and go for me. They're not my chosen form, put it that way. But this was a collection by another fellow booktuber. And it's Searching for Marilyn Monroe by Pay Vio, which came out in 2018. Now, if you know Pay's channel, and if you don't know Pay's channel, forget this, go and subscribe to Pay's channel, because it is actually one of the best things on BookTube at the moment. But if you know Pay's channel, you will know why I was intrigued to read his short stories. And as you might anticipate, they are intelligent and pleasingly kind of off-centre and quirky, and there's a strong streak of sort of melancholy in them, almost like despair about human nature, I think, which, yeah, none of which will surprise you if you watch Pay's videos. I was really pleased I read this collection. I like any collection of short stories. Well, this one's very varied, and there's a lot of different sort of shapes and sizes of stories in it, I suppose, or pieces in it. And that means that there's something in there for everyone, but you'll like some more than others, you know, any given reader. Yeah. So I don't like short stories, but there's a number of short pieces in this book that I absolutely loved, because they're almost more like prose poems. I think the subtitle of the book is something about animals and other parables, and some of them are they are like a parable. I responded really well to those. I also highly rated the title story, Searching for Marilyn Monroe, which is the longest thing in the book and is a really great character study with a lot of atmosphere. So a recommendation from me, and you can get it easily on ebook. There you go. So, what about the 7 novels that I read? Well, I've already mentioned Newby, 5-star and strong recommendation. 2 of the books, the novels that I read, I'm hoping to do a scallydandling video about. One of them is a rather strange little book from St Kitts and Nevis called Only God Can Make a Tree by Bertram Roach, and but I will do a scallydandle about it, because you know, if you're looking for books from around the world, St Kitts and Nevis is a tricky one to pin down, so it's worth sharing. The other is I want to do, just because it was a tremendous book that really brought this place to life in an up-to-date way for me, and that's Barbados. And the book is How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House by Cherry Jones. And watch out for my video about that, because it's a book I'll be, yeah, kind of, well, it's odd to say enthused about it, because it's a really quite a violent and sad book, but I will nevertheless enthuse. Yeah. So that's 3 out of the way. On to the other 4. Oh, well, now one of those was a reread, and that was Daughter of Time by Josephine Tay, which came out in 1951. Now, I last read this book in about 1977 or 78 when I was like 13 or 14, and it's a detective novel, but about the detective is stuck in hospital, and so he to keep his mind busy, he does a sort of a paper detection, is that a word? Yeah. Well, he looks back on the crime of Richard III and the Princess in the Tower, and sort of treats that like a whodunit. There's always a risk with rereading, isn't there, that something that you loved years and years and years ago, that it might not quite live up to your memory. And I have to say that was true of this. So it was still a 4-star book, but I remembered it as, you know, magic, and it was just good. But it wasn't a disappointment, unlike the next book I'm going to talk about, which is The Shadow King by Marza Mengiste. Which I buddy read with Katya of Read, Write, Create and Emily of Novel Novels, and none of us were that impressed with this book. I think Emily positively disliked it, and Katya and I were just sort of bit meh, choose Brown's funny phrase. I think the reason it was such a disappointment is that I really loved the premise of the book. I was really interested in the topic. It's set in Ethiopia in the 1930s. It's about women soldiers fighting against the Italian invasion. It should have been a really good book. And the reason that it wasn't was to do with Mengiste's writing style. And it's I'll try and explain. If you were to read one page or one paragraph of the book, you'd think, oh, brilliant style, really evocative, really descriptive. But put that together in a whole book where every page is like that, and it's just kind of like indigestible. It's overwrought, put it that way. It needed vigorous editing or something, and some, just tone it down. Mengiste, tone it down. So that was a disappointment. Happily, my other buddy read novel this month was much more successful, and that was The Posthumous Memoirs of Brás Cubas, which is a 19th century Brazilian novel by Machado de Assis, translated by Gregory Rabassa. And I read that with Alba Siriella and Sina of Beating Around the Books. And oh my, what a book. What a book. If it were written now, you would probably describe it as experimental fiction, except it was written in the 19th century, but it was experimental then, and it still feels experimental now. It's like a kind of, a posthumous memoir, fictionalized in little tiny chapters of a sort of Brazilian ne'er-do-well, feckless aristocrat. The author, you'd be interested to know, was not an aristocrat. He was sort of from lower class origins. A couple of his grandparents were freed slaves. So from this, you will realise that there's a kind of like a political satire about the book. It's funny, it's clever, it's engaging. It takes you to 19th century Brazil. But the best thing about it, the absolute best thing, is the authorial asides. He constantly breaks the fourth wall to say, oh, now you probably don't like me after what I wrote in that last chapter, but now I'm going to tell you, or well, I could really have left this chapter out, or, it's just really enjoyable. A 100% recommendation. Now, but only for the right reader. I can imagine some people would find it odd and irritating, but you'll know from what I've said if it's a book for you. If I tell you that Mark Nash liked it, that'll give you a clue. Okay, and he doesn't normally read 19th century stuff. Now, the next novel I'm going to talk about is Summer Water by Sarah Moss, and I approached this novel with some trepidation. And why? Why, you ask? Well, have you read Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss? Okay. Well, when you get tag questions about books with bad endings, well, Ghost Wall is my go-to book for a book with a really annoying, disappointing, bad ending. So you can understand why I was slightly anxious reading Summer Water, but hallelujah, this is a much better book. It's got the same strength in describing landscape and kind of atmosphere, but much less overdramatic in its sort of plot and characterization, a little bit more subtle, and much more enjoyable. Interestingly though, the least good thing about the book was still the ending. So yeah, maybe Sarah Moss has trouble with endings. Now, an author who is not afraid of a low-key, downbeat ending is Penelope Fitzgerald, and I read this one, The Bookshop by her. That was the very last thing that I read in November. Now, this is not quite up with some of her other novels that I love with a passion. The Beginning of Spring would be one, and The Blue Flower would be another. But it did remind me why, as far as I'm concerned, Penelope Fitzgerald is one of England's, or was, because she's dead now, finest prose stylists, and I don't say that lightly. So if you've never read anything by Penelope Fitzgerald, wouldn't necessarily start with this one. Not that it's bad, it is good, but yeah, there's even better ones to read. Now, that's it for what I'm going to talk about. I normally kind of end up asking what you read in November, but you know, it's a bit late for that, isn't it? Instead, I'm going to hope that if you celebrate Christmas, or even if you don't, most people get a bit festive around this time of year because you need to in the middle of winter, unless you're Australian, in which case, or like that part of, you know, the other hemisphere, but you know, assuming you're northern hemisphere, you need a bit of festive good humour. And so if you want some help in getting into the Christmassy frame of mind, this coming week ahead, there's going to be a chapter every day of A Christmas Carol read by 5 different booktubers, organised by Mark of Book Time with Elvis, and I'm one of the readers. And I'll put a link below to all 5 of our channels so that you can find that if you feel like it. I'll hope to be back soon with a December wrap up and also my books of the year. Bye.